Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and as usual, I'm here to try to introduce you all to something new. And today, that topic is going to be Dark Matter, the new Apple TV Plus science fiction thriller / relationship drama. This series is actually based on a very popular novel written by Blake Crouch, who's had several of his stories adapted to the small screen. And I've actually been reading this novel in parallel with the series, and I'll be comparing and contrasting, honestly, very faithfully adapting so far. Not too many twists and turns, but I will call them out as we go through the episodes of the series. I probably will not be coming back to this series every single week. I have a feeling, I'll get into it in some of my critiques of the show, that this is a 9-episode series. These are pretty long episodes. I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of filler here, so probably checking in at different points along the way. Critical reaction so far has been pretty mixed, but I am very curious about this. I love this idea of exploring alternate lives that you may have lived, a theme that is actually very relevant in pop culture the past few years, with the popularity of the concept of a multiverse, which has infiltrated all of the IP out there right now. Maybe all these creators are at an age now where everyone's having a midlife crisis. So along with this review and breakdown of the first 2 episodes, I also have some recommendations. I'll also have a digression here on the science behind the concepts here, which I find really fascinating, so do indulge me. But before we get to all of that, I wanted to shout out another Apple TV Plus series. I recommended season 1 back last year or a year and a half ago at this point when the series premiered. And honestly, no one's watching this show. I could tell just from seeing the metrics. I check not only for streaming data, but just to see the popularity of things on message boards, IMDb, Just Watch, which is a website where you can go to find out where to watch content, and you can sort by popularity. So you could just basically see what is getting traction, what is getting searches. And of course, if people are searching for something, they probably are trying to watch it as well. All that is to say that this show doesn't pop up on anyone's list of popular things to watch. But I love this show, and I don't know why. So I'm just trying to evangelize to you out there. This show is called The Big Door Prize, also based on a novel. This seems to be a theme with Apple, by the way. A lot of the series that I'll be discussing here, Apple-related, referencing in connection with this new series, are based on a best-selling book. And this seems to be something that Apple does a lot of. I'm not sure what their overall project seems to be, what their brand seems to be. They do tend to want some degree of positivity in their storytelling. You do see Apple devices in a lot of these shows, so it's just a place to brand their hardware, and maybe that's why they do so much science fiction. But in their most popular shows, for example, Severance, you don't see any of that branding. So once again, I'm not certain exactly who's making these creative decisions to greenlight these shows, or why they so often rely on literature for the source of those stories, but it seems to be the case. And as I mentioned, the Big Door Prize is based on a novel written by M.O. Walsh and published back in 2020, right at the tail end of the first lockdowns from the pandemic. I've never read this book, but it's interesting. I'm looking at some of the reviews for the book. This has very mixed reactions from readers, as does this series have some pretty mixed reactions from television audiences. And I would say the criticisms are, for example, I don't really like these characters. They're not paying off the science fiction elements of the show. And the biggest compliment I would make to this show is that the whole sci-fi premise, I don't care if I ever find out the solution to the mystery, which I think is a big frustration for folks, feeling that they're not getting enough breadcrumbs to solve this mystery of what's happening in this small town. Whereas my analogy would be something like The Good Place, where you're really tuning in for the sitcom elements. You're tuning in to see these characters dealing with this circumstance and trying to make the best of their situation together. It's almost like a workplace comedy, honestly, in that regard, even though it probably was promoted as being more high-level sci-fi, and that's why people criticize it for not being that show. The premise of the show, by the way, is a machine shows up, called Morphe, I believe. It shows up in the local convenience store in a small town. The town is completely idyllic. You have a multiracial, peaceful, really caricature of a Norman Rockwell-like fantasy, really just an ideal of what a small town would be like. Everybody knows each other, no one judges each other. And what happens is this machine shows up, prints out a card, and simply tells you one word, what your true destiny is. And what this does is that even in this ideal, perfectly in balanced town, suddenly having this machine tell people that they are supposed to be this other thing throws everybody's lives into disarray, but in the most genteel way possible. There is no sudden bloodthirsty battles breaking out in the street, which could be a direction that a show like this would go into. But that is not at all what the show is about. It's about the internal struggles that we face, questioning the choices in our lives, which in some ways actually dovetails thematically, broadly, with Dark Matter. And season 2 has come along after really not explaining things in season 1. And just to critique season 1, I thought the first 2/3 of season 1 were absolutely exceptional. I was just vibing on that show. In no small part, so much of it is the tone. There is this light comedic tone to all the characters. They're all a little bit goofy. They all have their own failings, but the show is very gentle. It does not judge them harshly. It shows all of their positive and negative traits. Once again, all positives in my book. And yet the series has this melancholy tone, in no small part from this incredible score, this really beautiful score that the show has. And this continues in season 2. Season 1 does not explain what the source of the Morphe is. We find out a little bit more about it now. But in season 2 also, the Morphe now evolved into a secondary level. And now people can feed their cards back in. And what they see is an animated, like a really looking like the old Sega graphics from the probably early 90s or so, representation of alternate lives they could have lived. Sometimes it's explicitly other decisions they could have made. Sometimes it simply is a metaphor for the current struggles they're encountering. But it really becomes therapy for everybody on the show. And for me, we're halfway through season 2. I think the first half of this season is really extraordinary. If any of that sounds interesting to you, I'd say check out the first 2 or 3 episodes of season 1. That's the tone. It's not going to change significantly. If you hate these characters, the show does an incredible job, I think, of making you care for them even more over time. But if you really don't like anybody in the show, it's probably not going to work for you. If you don't buy into this tone, if it doesn't touch you in some way, this show may not work for you. But for me, it really works well. And it's doing something that is so rare in television now. And honestly, I think Apple renewed this because somebody internally loves this show the way I do, because it's not very popular. But I'll do my best right here to try to get at least a few of you to check it out and give it a sample. I assume season 2 will be the end for this show. To be honest, it has not apparently grown in popularity from season 1 to season 2. So if you did sample it in season 1 and you're a little frustrated, I do presume that the mystery of the Morpho machine will be explained by the end of the season, because I wouldn't expect to see more of this, although I wouldn't mind if Apple just decides to renew it anyway. Okay, on to Dark Matter. As I mentioned, this show is created by Blake Crouch, the author of the novel as well, a very popular novel. My relationship with Blake Crouch's work is really in 2 different ways. One is I did read his novel Recursion, and in that case, also a thriller with a mystery inside of it, very similar in structure to Dark Matter. And the big idea that's being played with there is being able to be inside of a time loop. What if you could travel back in time, make changes, and then theoretically change your future, and you're trapped in this loop, which is a very long loop in this case. It's not a 5-minute loop or a 2-hour loop. It is a decades-long loop. And that is an entertaining book, another bestseller for him. I have my issues with him as an author in general. I feel he spends a lot of time setting up his concept. The characters can be a little thin. And really, his novels feel like screenplays in the fact that the characters are oftentimes not really fleshed out. It's as if they are just words that the characters are speaking. You can imbue them with your own motivations and agendas, but they really are almost looking for actors to flesh them out. And I did think about reading Stephen King back in the day, where the stories will be very high concept, some kind of monster story, and also written, and this is a compliment to Crouch's writing style, very easy to read his books, and I see why he's a popular author. But unlike Stephen King, who also has a very easy writing style, like a very natural storyteller. I find that even the most preposterous setups for Stephen King's novels are redeemed because you really start to fall in love with his characters. And I've never felt that about any of Crouch's writing. I'm more there for the high concept than I am for the character development. So that's my critique of Crouch in general. Although, like I mentioned, very readable. These are like beach books. Before I start breaking down the plot, here's some recommendations of other things you may want to check out that are thematically linked to dark matter. So minor spoiler, this is not really explained until probably late episode 1 or early episode 2 of the series, but it's right in the trailer and in the all the marketing for the series. So I'm just going to lay it out there that the basic premise of dark matter is someone who has the ability of moving between multiversal versions of their lives. And interestingly, Apple TV seems to really like this thematically. In 2022, they had a series called Shining Girls, also based on a novel. This starring Elizabeth Moss, who's currently in The Veil, and also featuring Wagner Moura, who we just saw in Civil War, and with Jamie Bell as a time-traveling serial killer and how he changes events in these people's lives and how they start to slip. People impacted by these crimes start to slip from one reality into another, into one multiversal life path into another. Now, this show was really interesting, I would say, and the most successful at this. Although, if you're the type of viewer that requires a payoff that makes sense at the end, the payoff here basically is magic. So if you're in it for the journey and not the destination, I think this is slept on. I think this is a show that's worth checking out and full of beautiful visuals, interesting ideas, a terrific performance by Elizabeth Moss and everybody, honestly, in this series. But if you really need a good destination, then magic might not be the most satisfying for you. And that's not really a spoiler. There's more to it than that, but it's not going to be all buttoned up neatly. I hear the book isn't buttoned up neatly either. Maybe a second season of the show would have allowed them to explore the mechanics of this in more detail, but this show is not going to be renewed for a second season. But I still think for Moss's performance and for the really beautiful style of the show and this metaphor of trauma fracturing your life, literally making you an unrecognizable person before and after, all of that works really well. Like I said, payoff not great. By the way, we did cover that on the podcast, so if you've watched that or plan to watch it, look for those episodes in our back catalog. Another series that I really honestly can't recommend, although it has some very strong aspects, is the recently concluded series Constellation, also Apple TV Plus, so easily available if you are currently watching Dark Matter, about an astronaut played by Noomi Rapace, who is on the International Space Station when there is an accident. Once again, an experiment that is trying to create an object in superposition, a multiversal event. And because of her proximity to the accident, she ends up existing in both multiversal planes at the same time. Once again, here, the journey is a little too slow. Her performance is terrific, and that's the main reason that you may want to watch this. Seeing this woman doubting her own sanity, dealing with the circumstance is really compelling, that aspect of it. But so much of the story just takes too long to get to where it's going. It needs a second season. Really, once again, so many of these shows setting up season 1 for season 2. It needed to deliver more in season 1, in my opinion, especially since so many of these shows will just never simply get a second season. But if you do love this kind of storytelling, if you do like Noomi Rapace, who gives so many terrific performances in projects, series, and movies that just don't quite work, do check it out if you're curious about that. I felt that it was a little too slow, but I often feel that way about these sci-fi series, and people seem to enjoy them a lot more than I did. For example, I had all the same criticisms about The Peripheral, which I felt just was all set up for season 2. I covered it here on a podcast, made that criticism, but many of you reached out to me and were happy with the series. But I still stick by the fact if season 1 is just set up for season 2, and unfortunately we don't get a season 2, it all seems a bit wasted. Long story short, my general advice is make a compelling season 1, and then you'll be much more likely to get a season 2. But there seems to be a philosophy of like, well, I'm not going to pay it off. I'm going to force you to greenlight a season 2. by not giving you a successful payoff in season 1. And if you see what's happening among these shows being canceled, that strategy does not seem to be working. So take that I guess, recommendation as you will. It's called Constellation, but if you do love these type of stories, this just wrapped up recently, about a month or two ago, and it explores a lot of the same thematics as Dark Matter. Dark Matter begins interestingly. We see this large cube, this superposition box that we'll discover over the course of the first few episodes. Interesting that they tease it in the opening moments of episode 1, and then we see it created again in this really beautiful opening credit sequence where it's almost like a puzzle blocks clicking together to create a similar cube. This opening sequence very much reminded me of another show that is a recommendation here as well, which is a series called Counterpart, starring J.K. Simmons from a few years back, right after he won his Academy Award for Whiplash, where it takes place during Cold War era Germany, where a tunnel has opened and never explained in the course of the 2 seasons of that series, an experiment gone wrong once again, under a government facility, which basically creates 2 parallel worlds that are mirrored at that doorway. And then, metaphorically for the divided Germany at the time, you have agents that try to infiltrate one side of the breach or the other. And it allows Simmons to give a really great dual performance as these 2 different characters. One a more genteel worker within this organization, and his counterpart, a hardened spy. And their interactions with each other and discovery as to what led in these 2 very divergent versions of their lives is really fascinating stuff. The series loses a little bit of its steam towards the end of season 2, never came back for season 3 to resolve some of these mysteries, of course, but do check that out. It's really, really good, and probably a more interesting exploration of these topics, to be honest, than what I've seen so far in this season in Dark Matter, although I haven't seen the whole thing. At the beginning of episode 1, we see Joel Edgerton playing Jason Desson, and he is a university professor. He teaches math to a pretty bored classroom of young adults. He's happily married to Jennifer Connelly, playing Daniela, his wife. They have a teenage son who in the novel is explicitly supposed to be some kind of really impressive teenage art prodigy. He's only 15 years old. I believe he's 15 years old in the series as well, but appears older. And Daniela is also an artist. She was once a very successful and up-and-coming artist who now owns a gallery in her Chicago neighborhood. So this is an interesting setup. People who aspire to greatness, and it's a metaphor for all of us who probably fantasized of the careers and the impact we'd have on the world, which in the end didn't quite pay out the way we expected. We had relationships, we chose safe careers, we had children, which of course changed all these trajectories. And that's what we're seeing represented here in the early part of this season. He's telling his students the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment. Very important here, of course, for the themes of the season. And then early on, interestingly, they show us Edgerton's character once again. He's in some warehouse somewhere. At one moment, we're thinking, is this guy some kind of secret serial killer? Like, what's going on here? What don't I know? I already knew, of course, because I have read about half of this book. And of course, it's in the commercial as well. If you've seen the commercial for this show, I'm always very curious about how something is presented to the audience, because at this moment, with no context, if you're watching this, absolutely no context, what are you thinking this guy is doing at that moment? He has some vial of some kind of chemical compound, which of course is going to be important later. And despite the fact it's family night, he's received a call from his friend, Ryan Holder, played by Jimmy Simpson, who you'll recognize from Westworld, you'll recognize from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. And he has selected to come celebrate in Desson's local neighborhood. They're in Chicago, by the way, if I haven't mentioned that, as a way to almost make it impossible for him to refuse the invitation to hang out with him. He's won some prestigious science prize. And we discover over the course of this conversation that really it was Desson who was the science genius back in college. Around the time that Daniela got pregnant, he had lost funding to his project. And I'm going to throw it in here. Importantly, that he's so clueless as to what's happening to him over the course of this show, or the first few episodes. His experiment was to create an object in superposition that was visible to the naked eye. I'm going to have a little science digression here because I find this concept really fascinating, so I have to spend some time on it. But just for now, that what's happening to him is basically what his experiment was, so that it takes him so long to figure out what's going on is a little annoying, to be honest with you, in the book and in the show itself. Ryan offers him a job. He's about to raise hundreds of millions of dollars. His profile's even higher now that he's won this award, and he wants Jason to come work for him. However, it'll probably be relocating to San Francisco. And Jason's against this. This is where his life is. He wants to stay in Chicago. But Ryan says, just think on it. But it's pretty clear that he is both telling him, I won't take this job, and yet he's looking at what his friend has achieved and thinking, you could just tell in Edgerton's performance, that he's thinking, this could have been my life. This could have been what I did. On his way home, he's almost hit by a cab. If some of those earlier scenes hadn't been teased here, you could actually read the whole entire film as he was hit by the cab and the whole series is a death dream. This is like a how did this get made favorite joke here, that, you know, so many illogical things that happen in films. You just say, oh, what if it was all a death dream? Well, we do have a possible out here with this near fatal car crash. And someone with a creepy mask and a recognizable voice confronts Jason and kidnaps him. In both the book and the series, this kidnapper asks Jason for his phone, knows how to unlock it, of course, because they have the same passcode. Of course, Jason doesn't understand this at this moment because he has no idea who has abducted him. But there are hints here already. As I mentioned, he knows his passcode. He knows a lot of personal details about his life. He takes his wedding band. He makes him undress. He injects him with something which makes him feel very calm. And later on, we find out it is Special K, ketamine. And then the masked man tells him that he can make the best of this. This could be the best thing for everyone. So knowing the context we know by the end of this episode, it is interesting at this moment that this alternate Jason does seem to have picked this version of himself, someone who is pining for the alternate life which he is living, but apparently is unsatisfied with. We don't know exactly all the details of that yet, but this is what he's hinting at as Jason Prime, Jason 1, falls unconscious. He wakes up, there's a full scientific crew around him. He's decontaminated. This is an extremely painful experience, by the way, in the book. Just hinting at that here briefly. We just see him like in a shower. It doesn't seem to be as traumatic. And this is when Amanda walks in to check in on him, played by Alice Braga. And we can tell right away, not in the book, by the way, an invention for the series, we can tell right away that she is taken aback that he doesn't recognize her. We know as viewers, way before he does, understand that they are in a relationship with each other. And he gets taken to see Leighton, played by Deo Okuneye, who he does recognize. We haven't seen Leighton in Jason Prime's original timeline, but the presumption here in both the book and the series is that they knew each other in some capacity. Amanda is taken aback yet again that he recognizes Leighton, but not her. Of course, unaware of what's happening. Despite the fact that he's happy to see Leighton, he's still super perplexed by what's happening here. There are people applauding him. He's a doctor. They start asking him a lot of questions. I know you're probably disoriented. I know you've lost your memory probably, but we need to just start with some simple things. What's the last thing you remember? He starts recounting being kidnapped. In the book, by the way, this is handled better. Obviously, you can be inside someone's head, inside of a novel, but this is handled pretty well. He intelligently starts reading the situation, saying, well, don't say the wrong thing. He just susses out that he probably should play along just for his own self-preservation. He also gets the lay of the land that this place is set up security-wise to keep people out, as you would expect from a scientific establishment, not necessarily to keep people in. It's not some kind of prison. So he can make an escape pretty easily, which happens in the series as well, but without much explanation. He just basically says, oh, can I go onto the hallway? It just wanders out of the building. But it makes a little more sense in the novel. And they hint at that here as well. When he meets a security guard, they say, oh, I haven't seen you in a while. Like they don't expect him to be escaping. He works there after all. Although he has been missing for over a year. Also, during this interview, we realize that other people have gone on similar journeys. He's the only one to have come back. And they want to know, well, how did you come back? Why did no one else come back? And of course, this is what they're very curious about on this probably very high stakes, very dangerous, and very controversial, if anybody knew about it, mission. And of course, this version of Jason doesn't know anything other than the only thing he can reveal is that he's not the Jason they're looking for, which he doesn't even understand at this moment. But even if he did, it would probably just endanger his life here. So he decides he's going to run away and try to get home. He was given his keys, his wallet, his cash, Obviously, he was not a prisoner, so of course, no problem with any of those things. So he's able to catch a cab, get back home, and he's expecting to see Daniela, but instead Amanda is there. And this is when she explicitly says, "We live together." Of course, the house looks totally different. This is also in the novel, although when he gets home in the novel, no one is living there with him. And the place is much more fancily decorated. In this universe, he's a very famous and rich scientist, a billionaire, I believe. So he has everything perfectly appointed, not the more rustic home he's inherited from his dad in the Jason Prime version of his life, with a university professor's salary. But in parallel action, we see this other Jason has come home and is indeed interacting with Jennifer Connelly. No cut on his nose, by the way. Very easy way to tell them apart. She's a little annoyed. "Where have you been all night?" He's like, "Oh, I drank too much," yada, yada, yada. She had encouraged him, by the way, to go out to have this meeting with his friend rather than family night, but obviously didn't expect him to stay out all night. And this version of Jason, this is just like the novel, by the way, is very happy to see her. And she gets suspicious, like, "Were you flirting with some girls at the bar? What's happening right now?" He makes the excuse that it's the fact that he almost died getting hit by a taxi, which does happen, actually. And it just made him appreciate his life so much more. Meanwhile, our Jason Prime, is in his alternate world. He goes into his office and he sees that he's the one who's won this prestigious prize. And he's made all these big scientific discoveries. This is the alternate track of his life if he'd not settled down with Daniela and had a son. He starts making phone calls to Daniela's cell phone. Someone else answers. This also happens in the novel, by the way. And by the way, he's much more subtle about this in the novel. Here he's just overtly saying, "Daniela's my wife," yelling this out in front of Alice Braga's character. It's like anyone who starts to investigate any of this stuff is going to figure out what's going on with him right away. He seems to be more protective of letting anybody know that he feels out of place, whether he thinks he's just insane or whether he thinks something else is going on. He still seems a little more protective about this in the novel than he is in the series so far. The government goons show up again at his home and he makes another escape. Meanwhile, Mastermind Jason, the Jason from this alternate timeline, has seduced Daniela and they make love as the episode ends. In episode 2, Jason shows up at his favorite watering hole, the same place he had met with Ryan earlier in the night. The bartender's the same but doesn't recognize him, whereas in his version of the universe, they all know each other very well. He checks himself into a hospital to see if he has any kind of brain trauma or any kind of abnormalities, a brain tumor or something that's causing him to imagine alternate histories. The doctor says, "Your brain scans seem normal, and I checked out all your biographical information. There is no Daniela Dessin anywhere. There's no son registered to any of the high schools around here. But I looked up your biography, by the way, doctor, and you're a very famous scientist who's disappeared for 14 months ago. Your brother has put out an APB for you." And Jason on an iPad does his own investigation and puts in Daniela's maiden name and does find her. The doctor says, "You know what? I think you need to be committed. You obviously are having some kind of psychological break of some kind." And he simply says, "I agree with you, doctor," but actually takes the opportunity to walk out of the hospital. Since he's voluntarily committing himself, it's not strange that he would just be able to check himself out. But he's just basically running from one situation to another throughout the course of these 2 episodes. I like when we see evil Jason show up at Jason's university job. Joel Edgerton giving an interesting dual performance here. You can definitely tell when he's playing one character over another. And really embracing the opportunity to educate these kids and really snap them out of what's probably very a complacent relationship between Jason and these students. This is probably where the show is working the best, when it's exploring someone stepping into someone else's shoes and embracing that opportunity. As a matter of fact, what this made me think about a little bit is the John Travolta, Nicolas Cage, John Woo film Face Off, where you have this criminal and this cop who switch faces, completely improbably, by the way, and start to experience life through the eyes of these greatest enemies of theirs. By the way, time to reboot that. Let's use modern day technology where you can swap not faces physically, like plastic surgery, but, which doesn't make any sense, by the way, like your body changes too. How did that work? Like, didn't your wife notice your body was completely different? But also, I should say, but in maybe a new version of this, swapping consciousness using some kind of brain link. Anyway, get working on that at Hollywood, okay? Leighton and Amanda are concerned of what's going on with Jason, who's on the run right now. They're afraid of information about their experiment leaking out. Jason, meanwhile, goes to Daniela's art exhibition, which was inspired by something he had said, and his images are all over this place, by the way, when he runs into Jennifer Connelly, Daniela, looking absolutely stunning with even longer hair. No wonder he gave up his successful life for this woman. Also here is Jimmy playing Ryan. This version of Ryan is more disheveled, not as well dressed. Jimmy Simpson does a really impressive job of conveying this. He also looks pudgier. Maybe they put something in his cheeks or something to make him look a little heavier. But he does do an interesting job of just showing the same person, but a little more neutered, a little more self-conscious. We get some more clues here from his interactions that he has been gone for some while. Everybody's curious as to where he's been. Daniela invites Jason to her apartment along with Ryan. Ryan and Daniela seem to have some kind of relationship going on. This is the same in the novel and the series, by the way. This is one-to-one. There's some very on-the-nose dialogue in this whole sequence, especially when Daniela starts saying, the last time I saw you, you told me how I may never see you again. I screwed everything up. Very strange thing to be saying in front of Ryan, maybe too personal. This scene is really awkward in the book. This whole sequence is completely improbable in the book in general, I would say. Much better here, mostly because of Jennifer Connelly's performance, to somehow sell all of this dialogue and show her conflicted emotions, but still how she's coming around to believing this. Because over the course of this conversation, he says, okay, theoretical situation. You wake up in this circumstance, you believe this is what's happening, what do you think it is? And they throw around some different ideas. He says, no, it's not that, it's not that, it's not a brain tumor, for example. And then Ryan says, well, then this person is nuts. And Jason says, well, I'm not nuts, I'm not crazy, which stops the conversation cold. But then Ryan starts to think, what kind of game are you playing here? He starts getting annoyed and he's like, are you trying to convince me that this is for real? He also hints at the fact, also in the novel, by the way, that he, as a biochemist, had created some special compounds the year before, around the time of his disappearance. Of course, this is probably the chemicals that are being used as part of this multiverse traveling process. And when he plays like he doesn't even know what he's talking about, Ryan hesitates for a moment, but then just says, good night, I'm done with this. He does offer to escort him out if Daniela feels uncomfortable. She says, no, it's okay. And he leaves for the night. Over the course of the next day, we see that evil Ryan is aggressively trying to assert himself in this universe. He's very territorial about how Daniela spends her time. You could see that she's training for a triathlon, I believe. She has her own life. This is obviously part of being married and still carving out your own interests and time, which he seems to not be okay with. He pretends like he is, but he's not really okay with it, I believe. After all, this is what he's been hoping for his whole entire life, dreaming about for decades now, but he'll allow it. He's also very annoyed that Ryan has spoken to her about this job offer, going as far as saying, you called my wife? So extremely territorial. I would say many things here are much better in the series versus the novel. This is better in the novel. We're actually sympathetic to evil Jason in the book because he seems to be so happy, really appreciative of Daniela in a way that probably she wasn't feeling in her long-term marriage and relationship with the other version of Jason. So basically both characters are sympathetic in, at least initially, in the novel, which for me is a more interesting dynamic because there's a possibility there of saying like, wait a second, is basically the bad guy potentially right that swapping lives would make everybody happier? And that's an interesting premise for me. It's my tendency to prefer having that ambiguity in these stories rather than what we see here, which is pretty clearly setting up that this Jason is a sociopath, basically. Meanwhile, Jason Prime is in his alternate world. He has lured Amanda out of the house by asking her to meet him across town when he's actually stationed right outside with Daniela in tow, and they start to do an investigation as to what might have really happened. He starts to read some of his notes from his work, and he realizes that the experiment he attempted years before has not only been successfully achieved, but that the object, this visible object in superposition, and hang in there, science corner is coming, has been built bigger and bigger and bigger. And now they have a larger and larger container where theoretically you could pass a human-sized object through this Schrodinger's box. And of course, that is exactly the experiment that he's been caught up in here. Whereas in the book, this is much better in the series, by the way. Whereas in the book, Daniela, over the course of that first night together, she just starts to go like, I don't know why. I think I just love you. I believe what you're saying, before things take a tragic turn. Jennifer Connelly plays this way more skeptically, but as the evidence starts to pile up, she does start to give into this revelation. I think the believability of this is all much stronger in the TV version. Evil Jason is back in this storage space where he's been storing his kidnap equipment and probably stationed for this entire year and change. He's looking at schematics to build one of these boxes. I presume that the last 14 months were spent building this box so that he could send his alternate versions back. And we see, just like we saw at the very beginning of the pilot episode, one of these boxes in this Prime universe. And after going on this exploration all day, we see Daniela with Jason Prime back in her apartment. I forgot to mention the whole fact that Jason Prime shows up at this art installation, sees his wife, the day before, she was simply his wife, this alternate version of herself. I mean, this needs to have, and it doesn't get into it in detail in the book either, but this would be a fascinating exploration of just this moment of what is your headspace to say, well, what is really going on? Am I simply losing my mind? But if I am losing my mind, how is this woman in front of me, who is my wife, who I've known for decades, who is, however, looking at me as if she hasn't seen me in years, or only saw me casually over the course of many years? And he's just kind of nodding his head and going like, yeah, sure, this all makes sense. And his friend shows up, kisses her on the mouth, and he's just sort of like, yeah, whatever, this is cool. I would love to be, spend even more time in this headspace. I guess you could do a whole book on that, but it is probably a really crazy moment that gets elided very quickly in the series, necessitated by, obviously we can't dig into it, but it is, when you really think about that moment in a microcosm, it is absolutely nuts and played off pretty casually. Now, in the book, Jason Prime does get lucky here with this alternate version of his wife. But here they are interrupted because just as he's about to kiss her, this security guard that we saw before, latent security guard, kicks in the door and, shock of all shocks, shoots Daniela right in between the eyes. And that's the end of episode 2. This also happens in the book, by the way. Okay, so as an adaptation so far, this thing is moving at a clip. All this is happening much more quickly than it does in the book. I think this is a much better version of the story so far for me. And I do want to put that caveat there because I found it takes us 40% of the book, maybe more, to get to this point in the story, where we're in 2 episodes into this 9-episode season. Now, that's why I put the caveat for me, because even as I'm reading the book, I'm way ahead of where the character is. So I'm like, okay, get to it already. Get to it already. I get it. Schrodinger's cat. I get it. Multiverses. And of course, this book was written almost a decade ago. So the fact that everybody knows multiverses now, whether it's everything everywhere all at once, whether it's all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Spider-Man Cinematic Universe, multiverses are everywhere now. So we don't need this primer, but of course he's writing it in a way where maybe you do. And since I do not, it really drags. Those first third or more of the book really drags in him saying, what could possibly be going on, with all these hints about quantum superpositions incessantly. So long story short, we get there much faster. So I prefer. On the negative side, I do worry. I do worry that here we are 40% of the way through the novel, let's say, but only 25% or 30% through this series. My gut instinct is that this might have a lot of filler here in the middle. Some critics have already seen the entire series, and even the negative reviews, and there's been quite a few negative reviews, by the way, say that the ending is really thrilling. All this is to say that I probably will not be going week to week with this on the podcast, but when there's big events, I assume right in the middle of the season, and then maybe come back week to week for the last 2 or 3 episodes as I would assume, the plot picks up again. So as I mentioned, 7 more episodes. So that's another month and a half or so. In the meantime, of course, we will be discussing House of the Dragon's return, wrapping up the shows we're currently watching. Sugar wraps up next week, Under the Bridge, and The Veil wrap up in subsequent weeks. The Boys is coming back. And Sona and I will probably be watching the new adaptation of Presumed Innocent starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Okay, before we get into Science Corner, some more recommendations, stories and movies that feature doppelgangers, evil alternate versions of people. The first recommendation I have for you, which is easily accessible since in the public domain, is actually a story called William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe from 1840. I'm going way back for this recommendation. But this is the granddaddy of all doppelganger stories, where this character finds another character with the same name and the same appearance that keeps sabotaging his life. And it's really so fascinating because every other doppelganger story and movie basically is borrowing this premise, but it's probably never more well explored than it is here. The questions as to whether this is some kind of psychological break or whether this is literally something supernatural happening is all the way back in this original story. So, and like I mentioned, you can find this anywhere in any of the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe. William Wilson, a short read, and it's fascinating and like way ahead of its time, honestly. Some movies you should check out. Enemy, speaking of Jake Gyllenhaal. Denis Villeneuve, way before he made Dune and became a huge blockbuster filmmaker, followed up his movie Prisoners, which also starred Gyllenhaal, with this low-budget film Enemy based on a novel by the Portuguese writer José Saramago. And once again, another story in which someone starts to experience someone else living their lives better, perhaps, than they are. Around the same time, Jesse Eisenberg was in a film called The Double with Mia Wasikowska. And similarly, you have this very demure Jesse Eisenberg character who finds that there is another alternate version of himself, which is just killing it at being him when he is failing at it miserably. It's a very, very dark comedy that takes place in a very surreal world, a very hyper-stylized world, but also very interesting. Once again, dealing with these themes of who's living your life better than you are. Of course, we have Jordan Peele's film Us, the very popular film from a few years back. We have the film just from last year, or 2022, called Dual, D-U-A-L, in which Karen Gillan plays this nearly suicidal young woman who doesn't appreciate her relatively unimpressive, uneventful life until she suddenly has to actually fight to the death with her doppelganger in this world to decide which one of them gets to continue to live. Now, these aren't actual parallel universe recommendations, by the way. They're purely doppelganger recommendations, intentionally so. Maybe I'll have a separate list where I recommend additional parallel universe films instead. But there are actually quite a few more of these doppelganger style films. And it's also one of my favorite genres. So do check out my Letterboxd. Check the show notes for the link to my profile. I'll have a much more extensive list of other doppelganger related recommendations. Okay, Science Corner. Objects in superposition. So what does this all mean? Do multiverses exist? We hear about this all the time. But I'm going to go a little bit into the science of it because it is really so utterly fascinating. Physics is so crazy when you think about what is happening at the quantum level. You've probably heard of this whole Schrodinger's cat experiment. Imagine that depending on the superposition of a particular particle, a gas will either poison the cat or not. An object, according to experiments that have been done, does not have a superposition until it is observed, until it interacts with something else. So what does that mean? Until that moment occurs, somehow the cat is both dead and alive in the box at the same time. And we don't know until we observe, until we open the box. And that's the moment when it has to pick a superposition. Now, the reason I want to go into this is because this is something we observe all the time, and it fascinates me. Okay, you've probably heard from your Physics 101 class that light is both a particle and a wave at the same time, but you don't really think about what that means. What it means is that you could fire a photon of light in a straight line, and yet it behaves like a wave, and we see them all the time. Think about when you wake up and the sun is streaming through the blinds, and you have your blinds drawn, and you may only have 4 or 5 slits in the blinds. However, if you look at the wall, you won't see 4 or 5 slits. You'll see dozens of these light lines. You have lighter lines and more pronounced lines in the pattern on the wall that's projected from the blinds. And what you're seeing there is waves, like when you drop a rock into a lake and you see the waves spread out. And then, of course, if they hit the edge of the pond, if this is a small body of water, and they come back in, you now start to see them collide with each other, and you start to see these higher wave patterns as they cross over each other. So this is what you're seeing. You're seeing this wave pattern on the wall. So therefore, light is a wave. However, we can also fire a photon of light into a lead plate, for example, and it makes an individual dot when it strikes the metal plate or photographic plate. So it's a particle. It's traveling in a linear direction. Here's what's so fascinating. If you set up a laser that shoots one photon at a time and you fire into that piece of paper with the slit in it, you would see when the photon passes through the slit, it makes a line in the photographic plate. If you have 2 slits, you would expect to see 2 lines, but that's not what happens. Even though you're firing one photon at a time, you start to see interference waves. What is it interfering with if you're firing one at a time? So it's behaving like a wave, even though you're treating it like a particle, which is really bizarre when you think about that something can be in 2 states at the same time. Even more strange is that if you put some kind of sensor on the plate, that the sensor being on the plate forces the particle into a superposition, and then simply by observing the photon in flight, it now becomes a straight line. It no longer behaves like a wave because you have basically forced it to be in one state or another. So observing the object forces it to be in one state or another. Now, this originally was only possible at the quantum level. The idea is that if any object got too large, it by definition would be in observation of itself in a way. There's just too many particles next to each other. So the idea would be that there would be no way to have something big enough to be visible to the naked eye that could actually be in a superposition. This only made sense at the quantum level. But just last year, there was a crystal that is visible to the naked eye that was tested in a superposition. All this is to say that theoretically, you could keep making larger and larger objects. So maybe something person-sized, maybe something like that is being explained in this book is possible. Extremely unlikely, by the way. But it is still really fascinating that physics even works this way, especially if it works this way on something which is big enough to be seen by the naked eye, which is pretty revelatory. Okay, which then leads us to the idea of the multiverse. Part of the theory of the multiverse is the fact that if something can exist in 2 quantum positions at the same time, then where does the other quantum position go? If it's forced by observation into one quantum position, where did the other one go? And some scientists believe that there has to be some other dimension in which the other observable behavior exists. So theoretically, there are almost infinite multiverses, which is, of course, what is being explored in this series of television. And then the idea, of course, then is, well, if there's all this stuff, there's all these many, many multiverses, how come we can't see them? Where are they? And of course, the idea is there, the title of the novel and the series, Dark Matter. The vast majority of everything in the universe, of all matter, is dark matter. It's something that we cannot see, but we know it's there. It has weight. There's something there. There's something in between what we can see, even at the subatomic level. So what is it? We just call it dark matter. We don't know what it is. We can't see it. But imagine that in there is all of these other possibilities. And that is what leads to this theory of a multiverse. Check out some videos on superposition, on the two-slit experiment, I think it's called. Double slit experiment, sorry. Do track it down if any of what I said here was confusing. I probably didn't do a great job of explaining it, but do check out some of these actual videos and experiments. It's pretty fascinating stuff. And if you are interested in physics, it does make you really think about how strange our universe is. Like, people are always trying to come up with conspiracy theories and magical explanations for things. If you really explore physics itself, things are pretty strange and magical without needing to have any additional supernatural belief system. Okay, so I will continue to watch this series. I will check in with it over time. Do check out the Big Door Prize. Speaking of alternate histories, next week I will be giving my final opinions on the final 2 episodes of Sugar. Coming up later this week, Sona and I will be discussing Under the Bridge, The Veil, and other shows we've been watching. Early next week, my sister and I will be, she hasn't been on the show in quite some time, we'll be discussing a whole bunch of horror TV series and movies that have recently become available to stream and watch, or in theaters or upcoming. Lots of horror content coming out. A pretty disappointing year so far, but we did watch a whole bunch of this content and wanted to put that conversation somewhere. And I'm sure there'll be a letterbox list to coincide with that conversation as well. All right, I hope you enjoyed this analysis. Give us a positive review or rating on Apple Podcasts or on your podcatcher of choice. Recommend this to your friends and family. You think they may appreciate this, or they're watching any of these shows. And I'll talk to you soon.